everyone. My name is Alberto Carrillo. I'm Chief Technical Officer for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and we are very happy launching this video today as we launch the revised draft of the Corporate Net Zero Standard for a second public consultation. The revision is following our established procedures for revision of standards, which are in line with best practice for standard-setting organizations, and this involves 2 public consultations, pilot testing, input from experts through expert working groups, review and approval by our technical council, and adoption by our board. This is a strengthened version of the draft that has benefited from input from hundreds of stakeholders that participated in the first public consultation, and also from input from experts that have been part of our expert working groups. We are publishing the second consultation draft for a second period to invite public input, and also we are using this draft for pilot testing with dozens of companies across different regions and sectors to ensure that the standard is practical and usable. The input from the second consultation draft and from the pilot testing will help us fine-tune the standard and finalize it before we bring a final draft for review and approval by our technical council and then for adoption by our board. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's session. We have David Kennedy, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and Emma Watson, who is our Head of Standards and will explain the content of the standard. With this, I'll hand over to David.
Thank you, Alberto, and hello, everybody. So let me start by saying I am pleased and very proud to be launching the second draft of Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2, which I think is a great leap forward for us. To contextualize it, I want to celebrate the success of SBTi. We are working with 11,000 companies globally, great representation in America, UK, Europe, and increasingly in Asia, 40% of market capitalization now, and I think that goes beyond what anybody hoped for when we were set up a number of years ago. The business case for climate action remains really strong. We are in a carbon-constrained world that is only going to increase. Companies face transition risk. They should manage that in order to remain competitive. And we are a means by which you can calibrate your net zero transition strategy and test alignment with the Paris objectives. So business case is strong, and we can help you with that climate action and ambition. Actually, the standard is all about ambition to action. It reflects years of learning with the Corporate Net Zero Standard version 1. It reflects very extensive and deep consultation and the expert working groups that we've engaged with over the last months. It remains true to the science, but it translates that science to practical actions that companies can take, reflecting the levers they have, and it gives different options that reflect the varying contexts for corporates. Now, Alberto and Emma are going to take you through in a bit more detail the many innovations in this draft of the standard. I want to draw attention to 2 things that companies keep asking me about. So, first thing is net zero ambition. Companies say, well, net zero, the year of net zero 2050, or ideally earlier, is a long way off. It's beyond our planning cycles. You can't expect us to define in detail what we're going to do over that time frame. And the answer is, well, net zero and the net zero ambition in this standard is a North Star. It is for companies to work towards, and the key thing is to act now in the near term in a way consistent with long-term objectives. The second thing that companies often ask me about is, well, we have done everything we can towards stretch targets that we've already set, and we are identifying that there is a gap emerging between performance and targets. And the answer to that is we're not in the shaming business. If you've made serious efforts, then our framework allows for that. It sets out a process where you assess your progress, you identify barriers, you set out remedial actions, and you reset your ambition. So if there is a gap emerging, we do allow for that. Please stay with us at SBTi. So let me finish and say again, I am very proud. I'm excited to launch this version of the standard, but it is for consultation, and we want to hear from you. So please do step up and give us your feedback. Thank you. And over to you, Alberto.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for these great opening remarks. Now I'm going to walk you through some of the main changes in the standard and then Emma is going to explain these changes in more detail. There are 5 key changes in the standard. The first one, or 5 key elements. The first one, as David mentioned, net zero is the North Star. Our standard is science-based, but we emphasize urgent action that needs to happen in the near term, which is consistent with achieving net zero emissions in the longer term. The second key point is we have differentiated approaches across different targets to ensure that we have different elements that are fit for purpose for the different levers that exist for the different components of the operations and value chain of companies, including Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. We also provide differentiated options and flexibility in terms of, for instance, different target setting methods, different metrics that companies can use to address emissions, recognizing that there's different operating context for companies. And as part of this, for instance, one of the innovations of this standard is the introduction of differentiated requirements based on company size and geographies. And that's very important to make science-based climate action accessible and adapted to different contexts. A fourth element that is very important, especially with the risk of overshoot, is recognizing those companies that are going above and beyond and that are taking responsibility for their ongoing emissions. We are doing this on an optional basis. Companies can be recognized when they are taking responsibility for the impact of those emissions, and it's a component that we find very important for corporate climate action today. And finally, as David mentioned, we're introducing a mechanism for companies to assess and disclose progress at the end of the target cycle, with a focus on improvement and transparency. And we see this as a key lever for companies to continue the decarbonization journey as part of the target setting process. These are the 5 core elements of our standard, and now Emma is going to walk us through the details and the changes in this consultation draft in more detail.
Thank you, Alberto. So now, as we said, we're going to look at some of the key topics in a bit more detail, starting with Scope 1, moving on to Scope 2, Scope 3, and then diving into ongoing emissions responsibility. So starting with Scope 1, the first thing to note is that we've maintained the proposal for the separation of Scope 1 and 2 targets, and that allows us to have specific target setting requirements for both Scope 1 and 2 because they're different beasts that need different approaches to tackle those emissions. Then when it comes to interoperability, so that's really how the cross-sector net zero standard interacts with our sector standards. So previously these were entirely separate. In the first public consultation draft, we were able to partially incorporate some of the sector-specific methods and pathways. But now in the second public consultation draft, we've fully integrated all of the existing pathways from the sector-specific resources. And that really enables interoperability between the corporate net zero standard and those sector-specific standards. One thing that is important to note on this is that the sector-specific standards will require some updates to fully integrate with the corporate net zero standards. So there might be a lot of questions on that, but please rest assured that that will be done after the public consultation launch. The next thing to look at for Scope 1 is around the target setting methods and metrics. So previously, we only had the absolute contraction method as the cross-sector method. In the public consultation first draft, we had proposed the linear contraction approach, which is a traditional SBTi approach, but we had also introduced a budget conserving contraction approach. We consulted on those options and found that we needed to do a little bit more work on the Scope 1 target setting methods. So what we've done is we've introduced 3 different methods, and I'll actually go into a bit more detail on these in the next slide. When it comes to performance, so in the current versions of the corporate net zero standard, the standard doesn't deal specifically with performance. So we started to add that in the first public consultation draft. And we had 2 different options for this. So first of all, the targets that were set following the first target cycle, those would be adjusted based on the performance via the method design or through purchase of additional removals. In this version of the standard, we have just included the option to adjust performance based on method design. If we go on to the next slide, where we look at the Scope 1 target setting methods in a bit more detail, here you can see that we have 3 different target setting methods that we're proposing within the new draft. So companies would select one of these options, and the first option is an emissions-based target. So this target setting method is suitable for all types of companies, and it uses the sectoral decarbonisation approach method, the SDA method, for activities that have sector-specific pathways, or you could use the linear contraction method for all other activities. The next target setting approach is alignment-based target. So this is the target setting method that we would recommend for companies that are not emissions intensive, they're new and fast growing, or they're climate solutions providers. And this really asks companies to increase the share of heat and owned transport from low carbon sources over time. Then we have the new asset replacement plan approach. So this is really suitable for companies in capital intensive sectors that would replace their assets in discrete and chunky cycles. So the company would design the pathway according to the asset replacement plan, but this would really be based on a carbon budget that would conserve the amount of emissions that they were allowed within that budget from the baseline until the net zero year. When it comes to Scope 2 target setting methods, in the first version of the Corporate Net Zero Standard, as well as the first public consultation draft, there was full optionality around the emissions reduction targets, as well as purchasing alignment targets. This public consultation draft encourages companies to focus on the purchasing alignment targets. So these are the low carbon electricity targets, with options to set additional emission reduction targets as well. And when it comes to performance, so we had limited criteria on performance around Scope 2 in our previous versions of the draft. And really, the first public consultation had a lot of placeholder criteria that we were looking to explore through the public consultation, but also with our expert working group. So within this draft, we have much improved criteria for purchasing low carbon electricity. We have requirements around asset lifetimes, as well as geographic and temporal matching. With temporal matching, it's important to note that we're introducing a very phased approach starting in 2030 for the largest consumers of electricity. When it comes to Scope 3, so in the first version of the public consultation draft, the requirements for the applicability of targets remains the same as this public consultation draft. So there was mandatory near-term Scope 3 targets and optional long-term Scope 3 targets for Category A companies, whereas Scope 3 was entirely optional for Category B companies, and that remains the same. When it comes to the target boundaries, so within the current version of Corporate Net Zero Standard, we have blanket percentage thresholds. So near-term targets cover 67% of Scope 3 emissions within their targets at minimum. And there's a minimum requirement of 90% of Scope 3 emissions within long-term targets. What we were really trying to do with version 2 of the Corporate Net Zero Standard was focus on what was really relevant for the company. So within the first public consultation draft, we introduced requirements around including categories that made up over 5% of Scope 3 emissions and emissions intensive activities that made up 1% of emissions or over 10,000 tons of CO2e. Based on the feedback that we received from the public consultation, we've really tried to narrow this down and make sure that companies were able to focus on what really matters within their Scope 3. So now the proposal is that companies would include those Scope 3 categories that make up 5% or more of their value chain emissions, and then set targets on priority emission sources within those categories. When it comes to target setting methods and metrics for Scope 3, so there is multiple methods that companies are able to use for Scope 3 target setting at the moment. In the first public consultation draft, we introduced more alignment options, as well as emission reduction targets and mandatory supplier engagement targets. And again, what we're really trying to do with this public consultation draft is bring in the focus. So there's a focus on alignment targets for the near term so that we can focus on the outcomes that we want to see to drive towards net zero, and then a long-term emission reduction target. Then when it comes to performance on scope 3, in the first public consultation draft, we'd introduced the concepts of direct and indirect mitigation. So direct was for mitigation actions that were traceable to the emission source or the activity pool, and indirect mitigation was outside the value chain. In this version of the draft, what we've introduced is transparency at the intervention level. So companies would be transparent about the actions that they're taking, and actions were available for lots of different approaches when it comes to alignment targets. Now, the final topic that we'll go into is around ongoing emissions responsibility. So here, what we have done is we've integrated the two frameworks that we had proposed in the first public consultation draft. So those two frameworks are beyond value chain mitigation and the removals targets. This is integrated into a single framework called ongoing emissions responsibility. And I'll explain a little bit more about that now. So when it comes to beyond value chain mitigation, in the first version, current version of Corporate Net Zero Standard, there is a recommendation to address ongoing emissions by mitigating those emissions outside of their value chain. We published a report on that, and since then we wanted to integrate this into the standard. And so we proposed a recognition framework for companies that were taking responsibility for these emissions in the first public consultation draft. In this public consultation draft, we have provided further specificity around this recognition framework across two levels. So the first recognition label that a company would be able to get through this framework is the recognized label. So this is for companies that are taking responsibility for at least 1% of their scope 1 to 3 ongoing emissions. And then there's a second tier, which is the leadership level. And this is for companies that are taking responsibility for 100% of scope 1 to 3 emissions for category A, and 100% of scope 1 and 2 emissions for category B companies. When it comes to removals on the way to net zero, so previously, there was a recommendation within the standard for companies to set interim neutralisation milestones to scale up removals ahead of the net zero year. And again, like beyond value chain mitigation, this was just a recommendation that wasn't validated within the target setting process. In the first public consultation, we introduced options on whether removals targets would be required or recognised. And we also defined eligible removals that were based on two options of durability thresholds. Within public consultation 2 draft, there is a requirement that kicks in from 2035. So right now, it's really an illustrative criterion that is meant to define the direction of travel for this requirement. And what that is that there will be a mandatory requirement for category A companies to take responsibility for 1% of scope 3, 1 to 3 ongoing emissions through carbon removal activities from 2035, as I said. Then when it comes to neutralisation, so in the current version of Corporate Net Zero Standard, there is a requirement to permanently neutralise residual emissions at the net zero target year and thereafter. In the first public consultation draft, we did not make very much amendments to that requirement at all. However, we did consult on the durability thresholds, as I already mentioned. With the second public consultation draft, we have proposed that at the net zero target year and thereafter, residual emissions would be neutralised through a portfolio of removals with at least 41% of long-lived removals. And now on to the public consultation. So first of all, we'd invite you to review the draft standard alongside our digital consultation guide and other explanatory materials like blogs that we've published on our website. There is a public consultation survey, and that is open until December the 8th. So we'd really encourage you to respond to that public consultation survey and get your feedback in by then. We would really appreciate your input, and it's really key to making the revised corporate net zero standard scientifically robust, credible, and workable for business. If you're a company that is considering to set science-based targets, please don't wait. Version 1.3 of the corporate net zero standard continues to be a credible and well-established framework to set science-based targets. And if you already have validated targets, please continue to progress against your goals, as these will remain valid until the end of the target timeframe. We will provide further details on transition guidance in due course, so please look out for them. In the meantime, we thank you in advance for your feedback and for engaging in this revision process.